And that's why there are so unnecessary deaths, there are so unnecessary suffering of people. So how can you stand in Moscow today? I can't understand.
Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Neilo. I'm your host, Neilo Sullivan. If this is your first time joining us, we cover a range of topics, and you can check out all of our past episodes on our blog at pwneilo.com or follow Perspectives with Neilo wherever you get your podcasts. In this episode, we dive into Russia's recent Victory Day celebrations, a day steeped in national pride and historical symbolism. We review the increased attendance of foreign leaders at this year's military parade in Moscow and key moments from President Putin's speech. We'll also examine the growing alignment between China and Russia, including Xi Jinping's attempt to connect the Victory Day commemoration to what he calls the 80th anniversary of Taiwan's return to China. And finally, we unpack how this year's celebrations are being interpreted across Europe, especially against the backdrop of the ongoing war in Ukraine and increasing international calls for a ceasefire, including from US President Trump and several EU leaders. The week of May 5th was a busy week for news, with the escalating conflict between India and Pakistan, as well as the election of a new pope, capturing most of the headlines. However, it also marked Europe Day and the 80th anniversary celebrations of the Allied victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. In Europe, the focus is on celebrating peace and unity, with the Council of Europe celebrating on May 5th and the European Union holding celebrations on May 9th. Moscow also marks this event, and the Kremlin announced that at least 29 world leaders were expected to be in Moscow for the Russian version of Victory Day on May 9th. The guest of honour was China's leader Xi Jinping, but more about that in a moment. First, let's look at some of the background and the significance of this celebration in Russia. World War II, or the Great Patriotic War as it is known in Russia, remains a powerful event in the country's collective memory. Many families remember their forebears who died in the conflict, either on the front line or as a result of the Nazi invasion. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in the war, with nearly 9 million military casualties. This year's Victory Day events were staged across Russia's 11 time zones and in occupied Ukraine. In the weeks leading up to the holiday, authorities launched festivities with World War II trivia competitions for school children, Victory Day themed events at private shooting ranges, as well as plays and musicals put on by theatres in Moscow and beyond. The Victory Day holiday, which had stopped and started at different times during the Soviet era, has become a defining feature of President Putin's reign. Vladimir Putin was born in 1952. And has previously told how a brother he never knew died at age 2 as his parents endured the Nazi siege of Leningrad. The Russian leader, who has spent the last 25 years attempting to restore his country's superpower status, has sought to celebrate the Kremlin's own version of history and justify the costly war in Ukraine and ramped up military spending. Now his legacy as president is being defined by the war he started in Ukraine, which has resulted in him being an accused war criminal and a pariah in the West, at least until Donald Trump returned to the US presidency and restored ties with Russia. Much has gone wrong for Putin since he ordered the 2022 full-scale invasion, with Russia's army suffering massive casualties and humiliating pushbacks as the US and Europe armed Ukraine with billions of dollars in weapons. Putin had harboured a desire to have his 2022 Victory Day parade in Kyiv if Russia had been successful in their invasion of Ukraine, but of course this did not happen. This year's celebrations took place in the shadow of growing violence between Russia and Ukraine, as the US continues its attempts to broker a peace deal. Putin had earlier announced a unilateral 3-day ceasefire in the war with Ukraine, beginning on the Thursday before Victory Day celebrations. Ukraine did not commit to abide by it, calling it a ruse by Putin to create the impression he wants to end the war. Instead, Ukraine declared its willingness to join a ceasefire lasting at least 30 days. Kyiv sent waves of drones into Russia in the days beforehand, disrupting the arrival of some international leaders to Moscow, with Ukrainian President Zelensky saying that they could not guarantee the safety of any international leaders attending Putin's parade in Red Square. Ukraine's foreign minister said Russia had repeatedly violated its own 3-day ceasefire hours after it began and called the initiative a farce, while Moscow said Kyiv had continued fighting. The parade on May 9th has always been a show of the Kremlin's military might, but this year Russia's soaring arms production allowed Putin to showcase more weapons on the streets of Moscow than any other time during the Ukraine war. It included Russian tanks and hypersonic missiles, as well as Iran's Shahed combat drones on their launchers. Weapons that have been at the forefront of Russia's invasion of Ukraine paraded in a show of pomp and patriotism. The parade also included troops from 13 countries, including those from China, Vietnam, Myanmar and Egypt, all of whom marched alongside Russian soldiers. China's state media, the Global Times, boasted in a social media post that 119 members of the People's Liberation Army Honor Guard took part in the Victory Day parade in Moscow. Putin also shook hands with 5 North Korean officers at the parade, including 3 generals that South Korea's spy agency said were leading the thousands of troops fighting alongside Russians in Ukraine. The parade culminated in an address by President Putin. In his speech to the assembled world leaders in Red Square, Putin drew parallels between Moscow's war in Ukraine and World War II. He cast the invasion of Ukraine as a special military operation to root out Nazis there, a narrative that has been widely rejected internationally as a false justification for an imperialist war. Security was extremely tight in Moscow for the event. There were snipers on every rooftop, and organisers banned attendees from bringing vape pens, electric scooters or any animals to the victory parade. Authorities also jammed mobile internet connections in the capital, citing the threat of Ukrainian attacks. This also meant that none of the international media that had gathered could broadcast any live transmissions. In fact, many foreign media present commentated that the event felt much more like a celebration of war rather than peace. For Russians, it served as a rallying cry, and there was applause when the troops who have fought against Ukraine marched past. But for those watching in Kyiv and other European capitals, it was an overt warning that Moscow has no intention of backing down, with Moscow undoubtedly feeling emboldened by the show of support from visiting foreign leaders. So, who were the foreign leaders attending and applauding Russia's show of strength in Moscow's Red Square? This was the largest gathering of foreign leaders at a Russian Victory Day event since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Kremlin announced that at least 29 world leaders were expected to be in Moscow for the event in a show of solidarity with Putin and his regime. Chinese leader Xi Jinping was Vladimir Putin's guest of honour. While Xi and Putin have met dozens of times face-to-face in the past, Xi's presence was a huge show of support for Russia, whose great power status has slipped in recent years. China has provided economic and diplomatic support to Russia and has remained a conduit for dual-use goods deployed to the front lines of the war. Xi was on a 4-day state visit to Moscow and on Thursday held a series of talks with Putin on deepening the no-limits strategic partnership which Russia and China signed in February of 2022, less than 3 weeks before Putin sent his army into Ukraine. China is Russia's biggest trading partner and has thrown Moscow an economic lifeline that has helped it navigate Western sanctions. Putin said the two leaders would personally oversee all key elements in their relationship, aiming for a substantial boost to trade and investment by 2030. Xi Jinping, whose country has been engaged in a tariff war launched by US President Trump, said China and Russia should solidify the foundations of their cooperation, and in a veiled reference to the US, added that they should eliminate external interference. Xi said that the two countries should, quote, be true friends of steel that have been through 100 trials by fire, end quote. In another implied reference to the US, Xi said Russia and China would work together to counter unilateralism and bullying. In a lengthy joint statement, Xi and Putin said they would deepen relations in all areas, including military ties, and strengthen coordination in order to decisively counter Washington's course of dual containment of Russia and China. In addition to China, leaders from Vietnam, Mongolia, Egypt and Myanmar, all long-standing partners of Russia, were also in Moscow for the parade, according to the Kremlin. The attendance of Presidents Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of Brazil and Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso represented Russia's efforts to appeal to the global south. Both have criticised the West and made inroads with Russia. The Kremlin has used Burkina Faso as a foothold to boost influence in Central and West Africa. Leaders from Zimbabwe, the Republic of Congo, Ethiopia and Equatorial Guinea were also present. Two of Russia's most long-standing partners in South America, Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro and Cuba's Miguel Diaz-Canel, also attended the parade in Moscow, and both held talks with Putin on Wednesday in the Kremlin. Cubans and Venezuelans have also been recruited to fight in Ukraine. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was initially expected to attend, but did not travel due to the ongoing escalation with Pakistan, according to media reports. Leaders of Russia's traditional ex-Soviet allies and partners, Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, Kazakhstan's President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, and Belarus's President Alexander Lukashenko, Putin's closest ally in the post-Soviet space, were also in Moscow. Leaders of former Soviet republics of Central Asia, including Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan, were also in attendance. The president of the partially recognised Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, was also expected to attend and hold talks with Putin during his time in Russia. Attendance at the parade has become a divisive issue in the European Union, and although the EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, warned EU leaders to stay away from Putin's party, a number of EU leaders attended. Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico made it to Moscow after blaming Estonia for denying his plane permission to transit their airspace to reach the parade. He was reported to have had bilateral meetings with Putin afterwards. President Alexander Vučić of Serbia, a country with historically strong ties to Moscow, but also with aspirations to join the EU, was also in Russia for the parade. And the leader of Bosnia's Serb-dominated region, Milorad Dodik, wanted by the Bosnian courts, was also scheduled to attend. So, given all these world leaders attending Putin's party, as Kaja Kallas put it, what was the reaction in the EU and beyond? Ukraine, which, as we mentioned, stepped up drone attacks on Moscow ahead of the parade, said that foreign participation in Moscow's event was akin to supporting Russia's 3-year war on Ukraine. With China's Xi Jinping being the guest of honour in Red Square, it's also worth noting here that tensions between Ukraine and China have risen in recent weeks after the capture of several Chinese soldiers fighting on the side of Russia. President Zelensky said on April 9th that 155 Chinese citizens were fighting for Russia on the territory of Ukraine. In response, China denied any role in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. EU High Representative Kaja Kallas said in regard to Russia's Victory Day celebrations that all those who truly support peace cannot stand side by side with Putin. Those who truly support peace should be in Ukraine, not in Moscow. At an informal meeting of foreign affairs ministers in Lviv on May 9th, Kaja Kallas reiterated Europe's unwavering commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and justice, as well as announcing a landmark €1 billion allocation to bolster Ukraine's defence industry. Here's more of what she had to say.
Thank you for having us here. It is European Day in Europe that we celebrate, and I think it's very symbolic that we are here. I think everybody who cares for freedom should see what we are seeing here today. And after you have seen the Superhuman Center, when you have been to the cemetery, you can't really understand how can you stand side by side with the guy who has really decided to send those soldiers to kill other soldiers, and that's why there are so unnecessary deaths, there are so unnecessary suffering of people. So how can you stand in Moscow today? I can't understand. But we are here together with the foreign ministers from Europe, and we have some very important deliverables. First is 1 billion that we are giving to Ukrainian defense industry, because this is where the innovation is made and where we can help Ukraine the most. And then a very, very important signal, also the tribunal, establishing the tribunal for the crimes of aggression. That means that nobody can be left unpunished for the crimes committed. Not even the leaders who have really decided to send all these soldiers here to also commit war crimes and all these atrocities that we have recognized here. So it is very, very important signal, and it's very important that there are so many countries already in the core group, but of course all the countries who stand for values, who stand for all the principles that are enshrined in the UN Charter should also join this special tribunal, because if there is no accountability, we will see this happening again. Thank you.
French President Emmanuel Macron and Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who were both in Nancy to sign a cooperation and friendship treaty, including joint security and defence commitments, hit out at leaders and others who attended Moscow's Victory Day parade on Friday. Tusk said that the presence of world leaders and other officials and their applause for Russian President Vladimir Putin after his speech about a so-called Nazi purge in Ukraine was, quote, a disgrace. Those attending, he said, were refusing to see the truth. He concluded that anyone attending the military parade in Moscow to mark the end of the Second World War had brought shame on themselves. Perhaps one of the few world leaders to call out the alliance of totalitarian regimes present at Moscow's Victory Day event was Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te. He said, quote, Taiwan and Europe are jointly facing the threat of a new totalitarian group. The bitter experience of World War II tells us that appeasement will only make the invaders more greedy and expand their ambitions. End quote. Lai was speaking to a group of foreign dignitaries gathered in Taipei at an event marking the first time Taiwan has officially commemorated the end of the Second World War in Europe. President Lai's speech comes at a time when Taiwan is facing increasing military pressure from China in the form of military maneuvers around Taiwan and grey zone tactics such as disinformation campaigns and spying. In fact, Xi Jinping used the commemoration event as an opportunity to once again reaffirm China's claims over Taiwan. In an article published Wednesday in Russian media discussing China-Soviet cooperation during World War II, he devoted a lengthy section to emphasizing the war's implications for China's claims on Taiwan. He described the week's commemorations as the 80th anniversary of Taiwan's recovery to China, writing that, quote, no matter how the situation on the island of Taiwan changes, no matter how external forces disrupt it, the historical trend that China will eventually reunify and will definitely reunify is unstoppable, end quote. Xi expressed China's appreciation for Russia's support for what he said were all measures taken by the Chinese government and people to achieve national reunification. And while the Chinese Communist Party may claim sovereignty over Taiwan, it should be noted that they have never occupied or controlled Taiwan for even a second in their entire existence. No doubt, however, Xi Jinping will take every opportunity to learn from Putin's mistakes in Ukraine to further the CCP's ambitions. As Kaya Kallas alluded to in the piece we played earlier, Brussels has agreed to back a special tribunal to prosecute Putin for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. It was the same charge that was brought against Germany and Japan when World War II ended. Back then, Russia supported the charges. Given this serious charge against Putin, and the reaction of EU leaders to Moscow's Victory Day events, surely then it's reasonable to ask how the EU plans to continue in their dealings with China. Until recently, the EU considered Beijing's no-limits partnership with Moscow to be a disqualifying factor. But on the week of May 5th, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Antonio Costa exchanged messages with Chinese leaders celebrating the 50th anniversary of EU-China bilateral relations. Von der Leyen and Costa wrote that this anniversary, quote, takes place at a moment of global uncertainty and geopolitical changes, underlying our shared responsibility in defending all the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. In this context, we remain committed to deepening our partnership with China. A balanced relationship built on fairness and reciprocity is in our common interest. The latest wording stands in stark contrast with the policy that von der Leyen pursued during her first presidential term, when she coined the term de-risking to eliminate dangerous dependencies on China, and regularly denounced Beijing's relations with Moscow. In fact, in a landmark speech delivered in March 2023, she went so far as to say that, quote, how China continues to interact with Putin's war will be a determining factor for EU-China relations going forward. Whether or not the latest doubling down on the No Limits partnership by the Friends of Steel at the Victory Day celebration in Moscow will have any impact on future EU-China relations remains to be seen. An EU-China summit has been planned for mid-July. In the meantime, EU leaders might do well to heed the words of Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te. At the time of recording, Ukraine has proposed a 30-day ceasefire and agreement to meet with Russia to commence talks in Turkey later this week. However, while Putin would appear to have agreed to the meeting, he has so far not agreed to a ceasefire in advance. If you'd like to find out more about the topics discussed in this episode, we've placed information and links in the Dive Deeper section of our blog, which you can find at pwneilo.com. That's pwneilo.com. There you'll also find links to all of our past episodes and our contact information. Also, if you enjoyed this episode and you don't want to miss out on any future episodes, we'd really appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe or follow button on your favourite podcast app. This is the best way to support us and really helps motivate us to keep producing content. Please also feel free to use the comment options wherever you listen to let us know what you think of these topics. But that's where we leave it for now. Thank you for listening, and until the next time, Slán agus beannacht.